In the last video, we got our project set up. In this video, we're going to jump into Mongoose. We are going to start posting data with our forms. We're going to save those into MongoDB. We're going to take a look at bcrypt.js. We're going to create a user model for Mongoose, and we're going to get login and registration basically working, but without session and without passport, and we'll see the limitations there when we get to that point. And so we have a lot to do and some interesting things to cover. So let's go ahead and get started with that. First of all, we might as well start with posting our forms. So if we go back and we look at what we have our forms. Let's close all of these files. We have our forms. What we need to do for our authenticated forms is to be able to take posted data. And so let's say we're going to start with registration because that does come before login. We can say router.post and set this up. So now we've got a post set up for here. And what I want to do is I want to res.redirect back to the register path. And the reason why I want to do this is whenever you do a post, if you just render at that point and the user refreshes their browser, they're going to get a warning to ask if they want to repost the information. So to avoid that, I'm going to redirect at the end of this. What I also want to do here is I want a console log, and I want to look at the request body. All right, let's see what that does. Do we have Node running? No, we do not. Now we do. I'm going to clear this because we're about to come right back to it. So on my index page, I'm going to go to register, and I'm going to put some information in. And the password I'm going to be using is test. Not sure it matters. Here we see our console log shows that body is undefined. And if you've used Express and created forms, you know why. By default, Express does not actually parse the body information that comes on posts. So to do that, we need to set Express up to do that. So let's go ahead and open up our server file. Our server file is going to need a little configuration. And what we need to do is we need to bring in a library. Const body parser equals require body parser. So by using this and setting it up as middleware with Express, we'll be able to get those request bodies. Now, I can't require this at this point technically because I haven't even installed it. So let's go ahead and do that. And as we can see, when I saved the file, it gave an error because I don't have body parser installed. So let's do it. All right, let's try it again. Body is still undefined. We've installed body parser. We've used require to bring body parser in, but we never did set it up as a middleware. So let's go ahead and do that. All right. Now let's try it again. NodeMon has restarted the server for us. Third time's a charm. There we go. We can now handle post bodies and go ahead and start saving some of that data into the database. And, well, let's just go ahead and do that. And so I already have MongoDB running, and I already have the shell running right here so we can take a look at data. So what I need to do now that since I already have that running, is I need to get Mongoose installed so I can start using it. Configuring Mongoose isn't all that hard. Just a few pieces to it. First thing we need to do is bring it in so we can configure it and get it started. There we go. Let's see, now what we need to do is we need to connect to our MongoDB instance. Let's go ahead and do that here. And let's connect to a database called Passport. Passport Fun, because this is going to be fun. So at the very least, that will work as a connection, but we're going to get a deprecation warning if we don't pass in a certain option. Use Mongo client, true. Another deprecation warning we're going to get is they are deprecating what they used to use for promises. And so for Mongoose, I'm going to set the promises library to use what comes with Node. Okay, and now we should be set up there. This will connect to MongoDB that's running on my machine. And now within the rest of our code, we should be able to call MongoDB, save data, get data, do things like that. All right. Now, whenever we use Mongoose, if you haven't used it before, what you do is you set up schemas, you set up models, and you use these to interact with MongoDB. So let's create one for users. And I'm going to create a folder called models. And in there, I'm going to create a file called user. And so I'm going to put my Mongoose schema information and whatnot in this file. To create one, we need to bring in Mongoose. And create a schema. A schema, think of it as a definition of what the thing is. And so in this case, we're saying a user is made up of two properties. Username, and that is a string. It is unique and is required. You can't have a user without a username. And you also can't have a user without a password. Except we're not going to call it password, we're going to call it password hash. And we'll get into this in just a minute when we talk about hashing. So here's a basic schema. And so we take this schema and then we create a model out of it by doing this. We'll export it so that we can use this elsewhere. So by itself, this should allow us to save things to the database. But I want to go ahead and stop here and go ahead and talk about password and how we're going to be hashing passwords. So let's go ahead and install a new library. We're not going to try to come up with our own hashing algorithm. That would be just silly. So we're going to install bcrypt.js. We're going to use this in the model. Okay, so here's the big idea with hashes and passwords. Okay, hashing is not the same as encryption. Generally speaking, when you encrypt something, you intend to get that data back out. Like, for example, if you want to do credit card payments on your site and you're not using a payment provider, you might take the user's credit cards and you will encrypt them so that if someone does get your database, it would at least be hard for them to get somebody's credit card number. And so that would be encryption. what we're not going to do is we're not going to encrypt our passwords. What we want to do is we want to use hashing, which is a one-way method for obscuring data. Encryption is two-way. You can encrypt it in, and then you can decrypt it out and get the value. When you're using hashing, you're basically make it in such a way where you can't look at the value. If you do it right, if you can't look at the value and ever decrypt it into the original value. That way, if someone were to get a hold of our database and were able to get a hold of our passwords, they wouldn't be able to use them for anything else because they would be effectively nonsense, and nonsense that they couldn't reverse engineer. So that's why you have hashing. And so what we're going to do when somebody saves their password is we're not going to encrypt the password, we're going to get a hash of the password and just save that. And then when somebody logs in later, we'll take the password they're submitting and the hash password, we'll let bcrypt compare them. And then if they're the same that point, or I should say, if the hash of the password submitted is the same as the hash of the password that is saved, then we can assume that the user did actually know their password and log them in. That's the basic thought process. Now the way this works in terms of code, or at least the way we're going to do it, will look a little bit like this. First thing I want to do is I want to create a virtual password field. What this is going to do is basically create a property called password. Then when somebody uses this property, well, if they do a get, it's actually not going to return anything. But if they set the password, what we're going to do is instead of actually setting the password and saving the password to MongoDB, is we are going to hash it. So here's the value if they set password, and we'll see how this happens here in a minute. The value comes in, let's say their password is test. What it's going to do is get a hash of that password using bcrypt. And we are going to say bcrypt.hash sync. We're going to take the value and set this value for the number of salts, essentially. And salting is a way of making hashes more and more unique. Just a hash by itself is fairly easy to deal with. There's ways around them. If you use salted hashes where you can't basically know ahead of time how people are actually hashing, if you use that method, then it's very, very, very difficult, if not impossible at this point for most people to be able to take your hash password and figure out what the actual password was. And so that's what this line essentially does. This does the hashing for us. And so then what we can do is we can say this dot password hash, and this is that property in the schema up there, equals that hash. Okay. Let's now use this and see if we can use this in the context of our registration. So if we go to register post, we've got the body, which means at this point we could start using that and maybe try to put that into MongoDB. So let's bring in our user model. And let's create a new user. And we're going to pass in for the new user, as the username will be what came in the request body. And the password, which as a property doesn't quite exist. This is the virtual property. We are going to pass in request.body.password. And so when this happens, it's going to be hashed. And we'll be saving it in the hashed version of it. So user.save. And so let's see, if there is an error, we need to do something here. So let's just start with console login. If there was no error, I'm going to redirect to the home page. Because after someone registers, I want to redirect them there, and then I don't need this bit down here. So let's try this, see if it works. First, check the terminal, see if I have any errors. Apparently I screwed something up. Cannot find module users. So let's go take a look and see why that is. So models user, okay. Well, right now, I know why this is. We're in the routes folder, and there is no folder called models here. We have to go up a level, up to the root, then up to models, and then to user. See if we got rid of our errors. That looks good. This is all looking promising. I'll refresh this page, and now I'm going to attempt to register someone. Okay, I have now submitted a registration and redirected to the home. I'm not entirely sure if that actually worked. I don't get any errors, so let's check the shell. And so we need to look in the database, and if we don't remember the name of the database, we can go to the server and say it was in passport fun. So let's use passport fun and say db.users.find and see all who's in there. Here's Tanis, that is our username, and look at that password. It hashed the password, which was test, into that very long string of not understandable text. All right, this is something that hashing does for us. It has obscured his actual password. If somebody were to grab my database and steal it, they wouldn't be able to figure out that Tanis's password is actually test. Now, test is a pretty lame password, so they might be able to guess it, but they couldn't get to it from the data. And that's the value of hashing. Okay, so registration does work. This is excellent. I want to try something then. What happens if we don't put any values in here and hit register? Well, we got redirected. That's interesting. If we look at our terminal, we will see, oh, there is a validation error. And so if we look here, we say there was an error saving the user. That was the message that I put in, and then there's the error. So let's go take a look at that. Let's see, we want to look in auth. So whenever we registered, here we go, we tried to save it, and there was an error saving the user. And so I set up the schema so that both the username and the password are required. So this can't work when you don't post anything, and I am getting an error here. We're not going to deal with the error at this point. We're going to deal with the error later. Right now, I just wanted to show you that this error message is something that you can look at this point, and it is something that is relevant. Later on, we're going to deal more with validation and messaging to the user when they do things that are wrong. Okay, let's try login. So we've already implemented saving data. How would we check to see if when someone submits data, if it's actually the right stuff? If someone says Tanis and test for password, how do we go and check to see if that's valid? Or if they do Tanis and they say monkey is the password, see that that's invalid. So let's do a few things here in the user schema. And so I'm going to create some helper methods here. So I'm going to say user schema dot methods equals methods dot authenticate equals function that'll take in a password. So what this is going to do is this is going to put an authenticate function on every instance of user. And so if anyone ever gets a user from the database or just creates a user on the fly, it will have this method called authenticate. And this is where I'm going to use bcrypt once again. And so this password will be the password that someone's submitting from a form. So this is when they're trying to log in. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare that password with the password hash. Of course, the password won't be the same as the password hash. But what bcrypt is going to do is it's going to hash the password that is submitted, and is going to compare that hash with the hash that I have saved already in MongoDB. And if they are the same, then this is the same user. This is right. This is a successful login. If they are not the same, then we've got a problem. Someone is trying to log in with someone else's credentials and doesn't know their password, or somebody just forgot their password. And so that's what this authentication method will do. You can also add functions not on each instance, but on the very definition of the user. And so you do it like this. Methods will add it to the instances of user. This will add the function to user itself. Okay, so this is actually the one we're going to call first in code, because a form post is going to happen, and we're going to have the username that they submitted, and we're going to have the password that they submitted. And then what we need to do is we need to go get the data from the database so that we can actually call the other function to check the password. So let's do that. So we can say this.findOne, and this is a Mongoose method. We can say this.findOne, and we're going to find somebody based on this username. And so if no one by the username that is submitted exists, then we're not going to find anything. If the person does exist, then we can check the password. So we're going to find based on username, and then we are going to pass a function like so. All right. In here, you need to pay attention to both error and user. So let's first pay attention to error. If there is an error, let's console log error attempting to use static authenticate function. We'll see later if this is going to show up. Now, if there is no error, and there is a user, and the user.authenticate returns back true, and this function, authenticate, is this one. So if there is a user and the password submitted is the same as the password that was originally submitted for the user, if that's the case, then this should be a successful login. All right. Finally, if there is no error and there is no user, then they probably got their password wrong. In this case, we're going to call done with null and false. In this one, we'll call done with null and user. And we'll stick with this for now. And we'll use these here in a second. We'll see where this is significant. Okay, so what did we just do? We created two new functions. One called authenticate, which is on the instance of a model. One called authenticate, which is on the definition of the model. How in the world are we going to use this? Well, let's go try it. Save this and go to auth. So here in auth, in our post, we want to use it. Okay, so let's use, first of all, that static one. Now, I mentioned first we use the static one because we don't yet have an actual user yet. And so we're going to say user.authenticate. We're going to pass in the username, the password. And then we're going to pass another function. This right here, this error and this user, this, the values for that are going to come from here. And so if an error is posted, we'll pass it into the done. Let's go ahead and do that. Done error. If there is no error and we have a user, we'll pass that. If we don't have a user, probably because they got their password wrong, we'll pass no error because there wasn't an error connected to the database or something like that. And we'll pass false. Okay, so here we are. Let's get this where it's not wrapping like that. There we go. So let's take a look at these things. If there is an error or user equals false, then I'm going to have a hard time logging in. At this point, it can't work because there's an error or we haven't found a user. So I'm just going to console log here so we know what's going on. That needs to be a string. And there we go. And I am going to log them back in. Once again, we're not dealing with messaging right now. That's going to be later. And so this right here, if we want to check messaging, we can look at the console logs and see what's going on at that point. Later on, we'll focus on the user messaging. So in both bad cases, we're going to redirect back to login after we do that console log. If we find a user, what we want to do is we want to console log successful login. So we know that happens, and then res.redirect to home. Okay, let's see how we're doing. First, let's check for syntax errors. Server seems to be running fine. Let's go to login and type in tennis and then test. And I definitely did something wrong. And so user.authenticate is not a function. Well, I apparently misspelled my function name. So this is in user on line 27. User line 27 authenticate. All right, server restarting. Tennis test. Well, that might have worked. Let's see, this should be a successful login, successful login. So this is going down my positive path. If this should be a successful login, this means there was a user and the password that they submitted, or at least the hash of the password that they submitted is the same as the hash of the password that was originally saved. So therefore, this is a valid user, and so it passes user right there. If, however, we go back to login and we put somebody that doesn't exist, and we look at our console logs, they probably got their password wrong, problem logging in. And so this is an error case. In this case, either the user doesn't exist or they just fat-fingered something along those lines. There was a problem. And notice I didn't redirect to the home. So I think that covers most of what I wanted to do in this video. It's quite a bit. There's a lot going on in this model, and the bcrypt, and the authentication. There's a lot here, and so if this is really strange for you, you might want to watch it more than once. So in this video, we covered bringing in body parser. We talked about bringing in Mongoose, and we created a user model to go ahead and save users, and we successfully did that. And let's see, we implemented the post for user registration so that we could save users. We implemented the post for login so we can log users in, and all of that's working. But even all that's there, we actually don't have a nice site with authentication. And the reason why is because by default the web is stateless. And between every page request, essentially the website is forgetting who we are. Sure, whenever we post the login, it looks up the login information and says, yes, I know who you are, and it redirects you. But it actually isn't remembering in memory who you are. And so whenever we do get to the home page, we actually still don't have any identifying information. For us to deal with that, we're going to have to start talking about session and start dealing with passport. And that's what we're going to do in the next video.